slides for Ethics in Journalism, Chapter 20. I do apologize. This is going to be the longest of the sets of slides, so I'm going to cover this whole section in one go. But I promise there's some funny things in here, including comics. So let's get started. So we've discussed why we need to talk about ethics with relationship to journalism and looked at the Society for Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And like I mentioned in the last video, we're going to look at some of the theories that kind of inform that code of ethics and actually then have a quick look at the code of ethics once we've kind of talked about some of like the three main ways that we can kind of approach this problem. So when we're talking about ethics for journalism, things kind of fall into three broad categories. The first is known as the ethics of duty. The second is the ethics of final ends or consequences. And the third kind of category that we tend to hear applied to journalism is the ethical philosophy where you want to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So I'm going to tell you what each of those three kind of actually consists of, and then I'm going to touch really briefly on kind of the broader philosophical area that the third one kind of is a part of, and then we'll talk about how that applies to that code that we looked at. So the ethics of duty is what's called an absolute moral philosophy, where there's right and wrong, there isn't any gray area. Absolute journalists are concerned only whether or not the event is newsworthy. They might say, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just concerned about whether or not this thing is newsworthy, and therefore I'm going to report on it. They come at it from the idea that as journalists, because we have an imperative within the First Amendment, the First Amendment confers rights, but it also therefore puts an onus or puts a kind of like a charge of duty on journalists to do things ethically because we have a function within our democratic society. So for them, we're looking at, if you're looking at basically any of the theories behind the First Amendment, you've got a kind of charge for journalists. With that power comes that responsibility. So for people who adhere to the ethics of duty, there are going to be some actions that are always right and some actions that are always wrong. For those who adhere to an ethics of duty, the ends will never justify the means. So in this case, where if you're playing D&D, you're lawful good or lawful neutral, you are going to follow the law no matter what. There is no story for which it makes sense to break the law. They are going to follow Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. So for those of us who are maybe less into our philosophical theory, here's a great example of Immanuel Kant going to play poker with the other philosophers. And, I'm going like, it's all right, he'll be cool. So we're going to play some Texas Hold'em. He needs to get out more. One guy raises. All right, I'm going to raise you back 30. And then Hegel says, you got a good hand there, Kant? And Kant says, yes, I have 2 nines. Nietzsche says, Kant, you aren't supposed to tell us if you've got a good hand. In fact, you're supposed to make us think you have a bad hand, so we'll bet more. And Kant goes, but that's lying. And Hegel tells him, that's the point of the game. And so Kant points out that your game is a means to an end and that it's not a good game. And then, we find out that Nietzsche's actually cheating. So, that is a funny example of the fact that people who are following a moral imperative are not going to, or Kant's categorical imperative, people who think that there is an absolute right and wrong are not going to lie in order to get what they want because they believe that that is inherently wrong. So how does that work in practice for journalism? Well, Reuters has a fairly absolutist ethical policy. And again, as I mentioned in the last set of slides, where this kind of comes home and where it can really impact you beyond just, your own, feelings of whether or not you're a good person, is that if your news organization has an ethical policy and you break it, you could be putting your job in jeopardy. So there are 10 absolutes for Reuters journalists. And here they are, always hold accuracy sacrosanct, which means sacrosanct is not religious, but like this is something that you cannot touch. It is untouchable. Always correct an error openly, so you're going to be very open about your errors, so that's kind of goes back to transparency. Always strive for balance and freedom from bias. Reveal conflict of interest to a manager. Respect privileged information, so like if something was confidential, you never ever reveal it. You never fabricate and you never plagiarize. You always protect your source from the authorities. That means even if you end up going to jail. Always guard against putting a source's opinion in a news story. Never alter a still or moving image beyond the requirements of normal image enhancements. And never pay for a story and never accept a bribe. So if you were working at Reuters or for Reuters, you would be expected to uphold these 10 principles no matter what, and that if you broke any of them, you could lose your job. So kind of another way to come at your ethical obligations is to look at the ethics of final ends or consequences. Now, I think final ends should give you a clue as to whether or not the ends are going to justify the means in this particular ethical code. This is what's called a relativist ethic. So that means that everything is relative. If the ends are, you're weighing up, say, the legality versus the potential good that your story could do. And if the potential good is greater than the ethical wrongdoing that it would take in order to reach that good, well then you would in fact break the law in order to do the greater good. So actions that have right consequences are inherently ethical. So in this case, intentions really do matter. Relativist journalists will do whatever is necessary if the goal is protecting the common good, being a government watchdog, or keeping the public fully informed. So again, if we go back to our First Amendment theory and we look at the idea of the checks and balances theory, Blasey kind of saying that we need to be a check on the government, then a journalist who maybe adheres to the ethics of final ends would say, well, part of the First Amendment isn't just, an immoral obligation to tell the truth, but we also have an obligation to be a watchdog against the government. And sometimes things are labeled confidential, and they're labeled that in order to protect people in power, instead of actually kind of helping society know the truth. And so it's more important, in order to tell the truth, we need to sometimes bend or break the rules. So that is the ethics of final ends or consequences. Calvin and Hobbes, which is, by the way, super philosophical if you didn't know. It's awesome. We've got Calvin and Hobbes here. How are you doing with your New Year's resolutions? Calvin didn't make any. See, in order to improve oneself, one must have some idea of what's good. That implies certain values. But as we all know, values are relative. Every system of belief is equally valid, and we need to tolerate diversity. Virtue isn't better than vice, it's just different. And of course, Hobbes says, I don't know if I can tolerate them as tolerance. Calvin, I refuse to be victimized by notions of virtuous behavior. Because of course, Calvin wants to get away with anything. In Calvin's case, it doesn't matter whether the ends are good, that always justifies the means. In the case of a good and ethical journalist, you will only justify the means if in fact those ends are good. We've also got this existential comic where we've got Kant, the moral absolutist, arguing with Mill, who we're going to get to in a second, who is about the greatest good for the greatest number. And there's trick candles on Kant's birthday cake. And so, Kant says that that's immoral. And, Mill saying, hey, there's more fun for everybody if you can't blow out your candles. So how can it be immoral if we're creating more good for more people? So it doesn't matter if people enjoy it. It's wrong no matter what. So Mill having this conversation with Kant brings us to the greatest good for the greatest number. So in this case, we're saying that Immanuel Kant is pissed off because people are laughing at him because he couldn't blow out his candles. And Mill is like, yeah, but you brought mirth to like 20 people, so it's totally worth it. Jeremy Bentham is another guy who is also into this definition of ethics. And this definition of ethics is often called utilitarianism. Most journalists probably would subscribe to the utilitarian kind of edict. And this is where, going back to the ethical code of the Society for Professional Journalists, the minimizing harm. The kind of, with minimizing harm is maximizing good, is the kind of flip side to that. And this is the idea that you want to do as much good as possible for the most number of people. So you're kind of serving society as a whole. Occasionally that's going to mean that some people are going to be harmed by what you do, but the point is you need to kind of weigh up all of the options and go for the one that creates the greatest amount of good. Now that sounds terrific, but I would also like to point out that utilitarianism does have its flip side as well. All things do. P.S. Jeremy Bentham was bonkers. In fact, this is true. Jeremy Bentham donated his body to a college or a university in England where he is preserved, his entire body and his clothes. And they've remade him. And in fact, it does get a vote on certain things. It's called the auto icon. They did actually remove his head and put a different head on. One, because they did such a bad job preserving his head and face. He looks freaky. And two, because students at the university used to steal his head and use it as a soccer ball. Not lying. It's amazing. Philosophy's great. So, in this comic, the auto icon comes to life at night and it wants to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Well, guess what? That includes killing good old Sam here. Doesn't want your money, Sam. He needs his organs because he can kill Sam in order to save 5 other people. And if you kill one person to save 5, there is more total happiness in the world. Therefore, it is worth killing one person to save 5. Here, Philippa Foot, the creator of the trolley problem, stops him and says, nope, you cannot, take away one person's rights in order to save 5 people. That ain't how life works. And so she ties him to a trolley track. And, if you know the trolley problem, then this will amuse you. And if you don't, you can look it up and have more fun with philosophy. So yes, Philippa Foot said, goodness comes from the virtue of a person, not from a state of affairs in the world. So you can't just maximize happiness. So, do weigh up things like when you're minimizing harm. Who are you causing harm to in order to cause this good? Is it a marginalized group? Is it a group that already has a lot going against them? These are things where you do need to, again, not necessarily adhere to anything, absolutely not even moral relativism. So just kind of keep in mind that you need to take the whole picture into account every time you make one of these decisions. And as people point out, yes, this takes time and effort and energy and thinking. And really, if you come to a moral and ethical decision too quickly, there's a good reason to maybe stop and think about it a little bit more. Utilitarianism is a type of what's called situational ethics. So situational ethics, are a form of relative ethics. And they go back all the way to the Golden Rule. When you talk about love your neighbor as yourself, and then we've got another kind of Greek idea of virtue being found in the middle. You don't want to have extremes. And it's kept going all the way to contemporary times, because in fact, if you have heard of Ayn Rand is all about rational self-interest, where you do good things not because you're good, but because you want people to think you're good, and you want the ends that come about because of the quote-unquote good thing that you did. Here's a dinosaur comic where we talk about where Mr. T-Rex is a generous guy. If someone wants to go in front of me in traffic, I slow down and let them in. But it's all an act. I let someone cut in front of me for 2 reasons. Because I figure that's way more likely they're going to do the same for me in future, and because I recognize that it helps the traffic system as a whole. But this isn't generosity. It's greed. It's well-presented greed. It's me selfishly wanting to get around quickly so badly that I'll sacrifice the short term for the long term. And that kind of boils down what Ayn Rand's getting at with her rational self-interest, that you actually might do an altruistic thing, but for the wrong reasons. So again, going back to the SPJ Code of Ethics, things like seeking truth and report it, well, you can look at that as an absolute ideal, that our goal is we've got this moral imperative to go out and seek truth and report it to the people. But when you talk about things like minimizing harm, that's maybe looking at it from more of a utilitarian standpoint, where you're wanting to kind of balance up the good and the bad in the world and see overall, are you causing more harm than good? Acting independently, again, that one's maybe more of a absolutist look, where you're like, I want to stop having any kind of bias. So again, looking back at Reuters' 10 things, there were a couple things in there talking about bias and talking about conflicts of interest. But accountability and transparency, that's again very much that kind of relative thing, where we want to be very aware and to tell people, hey, this was why I did what I did. And the idea that if you're transparent about it and people understand why you did what you did, then that kind of can justify, again, the ends can justify those means. So those are the theories we're going to use when we go and approach these issues. So the next set of slides talks about how we actually go about solving or like thinking through a moral and ethical issue. But in order to do that, you need to be able to draw on these theories. And again, in the homework, I want you to think about which one of these are going to apply in any of those situations that are laid out. So you need to have a bit of a grasp of this stuff in order to then apply it in the next set of slides.